in this lesson, we'll set up a control to have the hands follow the hips. So this will act as a teaser, if you will, for our cartoon rigging training. Let's go to our perspective view, and also we'll make sure that the auto key is turned off. So what we're going to want to do, rather than having the hands follow the hip as we rotate the hip when the character adjusts his belt buckle, instead we'll want a switch so we can very conveniently take care of that that part of the animation. It's going to make it a little bit easier on us. So with auto key turned off, we'll start by just setting back to bind pose our controls. Okay, that's the arm controls. We'll set those back to 0. Don't need to worry about the fingers. We will want to get the elbows, set those back. The chest, the back control, set all of those back to 0. Okay. The shoulders as well. The legs will be fine. So once we have our upper body controls back to 0, and you could always go through and just double check to make sure that the values are brought back. Now we're ready to work on our connection. So if we select, let's start with the right arm. If we select that, go to our outliner, frame it, and hit up arrow, we can see there's a group with a constraint tied to it. And what we'll need to do is take the hips and constrain the group to the hips. Okay, to add that connection, you can see the other connections that it has to the hat, to the chest, to the world node, which is going to be important as well. So we'll select the hip. We'll control click the group of the arm, not the arm itself, but the group, GRP, as a prefix, and we'll go to constrain and we'll make a parent constraint to add that. So now that that is done, we're ready to work on a set driven key. So let's go ahead and open that up. That's Animate, Set Driven Key, Set Options. We'll want to select the parent constraint, load that as the driven, the driver. Before we load that up, we're going to need to work on another switch. Okay, right now we have world, chest, and hat, but we need to have a hip switch. So with that selected, we'll go to Modify, we'll go to Edit Attribute, select the Follow switch, and now go right under the world, okay, the world text, to this blank space, and here we can add another name or another switch. We'll call it Hip and just hit Enter. So now that that's done, if we go back, notice we have another switch, the hip. Okay, so first off, to have this now follow the hip, okay, we can switch the follow to hip and now load this as driver. We'll select follow, select the hip, and we'll want to set a key. But what we also want to do is go to the world node. So let's make sure the parent constraint is selected and make sure that the world is going to be set to 0. So it won't follow the world node. Okay. And then with that set to 0, again with follow and then with world selected, we'll also want to set a key to lock that in. Now we'll need to switch this. Okay, we'll basically need to go to our switching the follow to world. Okay, then go to the parent constraint and switch world to 1, which it already should be, and the hip, we'll switch that to 0. From there, we can just select the world, control click the hip. Okay, follow should still be selected, and we'll select key. Great. And what's nice when we select the, let's say, hat, for example, if we were to go to that, and notice we won't need to adjust the hip weight at all. Okay, we just needed to switch it for the world and for, of course, the hip constraint. So what happens now is if we select the hand, switch this to hip, go to our hip control, notice that the hand is now going to follow the hip. Great. So again, that's going to make it easier for when we have him twist his belt as he's pulling his pants up. Alright, so now we'll do the same for the left arm. Okay, it's the same process. If you want, you can add the extra switch in there first. Go to follow. Okay, right under flashlight this time we'll add hip. Okay, go back to the set driven key menu. That's animate, set driven key, set options. Load this as the driver. And we could activate the hip right now. Now we'll want to do a parent constraint. With the hip selected first, we select our arm control and we go to parent constraint. Oh, and notice I did exactly what we weren't supposed to do there. We select the group first, or the group second actually, but not the control itself, because you saw what happens. It's going to mess up our connection. So we'll select the hip. We'll control click the left arm group, GRP, arm control. And now we can do our connection, constrain, parent constraint. There it is. Now we want to load the parent constraint, so we'll select that. Load that as the driven. Okay, we'll want to turn off the weight of the flashlight in this case, so we'll zero that out. And so that just the weight of the hip is turned on. We can select the hip, the flashlight, the world. Follow should still be selected, and we'll press set key once we make sure that the hip is turned on. Alright, great. So now if we switch the follow to world, let's go ahead and do that. We'll go back to our parent, and we'll just make sure that we put in a value of 0 for the hip. And now all we need to do is select the hip and set a key. Alright, so now if we were to, let's say, switch or move the hip, there's no movement from this left arm. But if we were to bring this to the hip now, it should move just fine. Alright, great. The bending, of course, is happening because of the elbow controls. And even if we were to switch this to flashlight, we shouldn't get any movement of the hip. Unless the, but of course the flashlight would be following the hip, so that's just fine. Alright, great. So that's how we set up the control for that. And now with that done, we could just simply drag our time slider to go back to where we once were with our poses. We'll select our arms, switch those back to world to fix their position. Alright, so when we get to working on our next pose, which we'll go ahead and do in the next lesson, we'll have a much easier process of having the arms follow the hip.